It was just another ordinary morning for Officer Kate Ramirez, or so everyone thought. A woman in a police uniform, working quietly behind the scenes, barely noticeable to the world outside. But what they didn't know about Kate was more dangerous than anything they could imagine. Working under the radar, she knew more about the powerful people in her city than they realized. She was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to make her move. Kate wasn't always just another officer on the beat. She had a history, a secret life that few could comprehend. Those who knew her often underestimated her, seeing only a young woman with a badge, not knowing that she held the key to a scandal that could shake the very foundations of the city's government. For years, she had kept quiet, watching from the sidelines as the city's most powerful figures made their moves. The rich businessmen, the well-dressed politicians, they all thought they could do whatever they wanted. They thought they could get away with anything. But Kate had learned early on that the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how hard people tried to bury it. Her office at the precinct was small and overlooked. Most officers passed by without giving her a second glance. She was good at staying in the background, a quiet presence in a room full of loud personalities. But she saw everything. And she remembered everything. Kate's partners didn't understand why she never raised her voice. They never understood why she stayed so calm when others lost their tempers. She had her reasons. As much as she wanted to speak out, to reveal the secrets she held, she knew it wasn't the right time. Not yet. But today, something felt different. There was a sense in the air, something that made her feel like this ordinary day would not be ordinary after all. Something was coming, and she had to be ready for it. The precinct buzzed with its usual energy, the sound of phones ringing and officers calling out to one another. Kate sat at her desk, going through her paperwork, when she heard a familiar voice. "Kate, can I talk to you for a minute?" It was Sergeant Daniels, one of the senior officers in the precinct. He had a look in his eyes, one that made Kate pause. There was something urgent about the way he called her. "Of course," Kate replied, pushing her chair back and standing up. Daniels led her to a quiet corner of the station. As soon as they were out of earshot from the other officers, he leaned in, his voice low. "I need you to be careful. I don't know how much you know, but there's something big going on. It's involving Thompson." Kate's heart skipped a beat. Charles Thompson. The name sent a cold shiver down her spine. He was the wealthiest and most influential man in the city, and he had ties to nearly every politician, every businessman, every important figure in town. If Thompson was involved, it meant things were much worse than she could have imagined. "I don't know what you mean," Kate said, though she could feel her pulse quicken. She tried to keep her voice steady, but inside, she was already connecting the dots. She had suspected that Thompson had his hands in some shady dealings, but hearing Daniels confirm it sent a surge of adrenaline through her veins. Daniels glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "I don't have all the details, but I know enough to tell you that Thompson's people are covering their tracks. He's been moving a lot of money around. Big money. Money that doesn't make sense. It's tied to something illegal, I can feel it." Kate's mind raced. Illegal activities weren't anything new in the city. But what Daniels was saying was different. If Thompson was behind it, it was bigger than any drug deal or small-time robbery. This was something deep, something that could bring down the city's entire government. "I'll keep my eyes open," Kate said, her voice firm. "Thanks for the heads up, Sergeant." Daniels nodded, but his worried expression didn't fade. "Be careful, Kate. This isn't something you want to get involved with. People like Thompson, he's got connections. People who would do anything to protect him." Kate smiled faintly, but there was no humor in her eyes. "I'm always careful." She wasn't sure if Daniels was warning her to stay away or asking her to dig deeper. Either way, she knew one thing for sure, the game was about to change, and she wasn't going to back down. As Daniels walked away, Kate turned back to her desk. Her mind was already on fire with thoughts of how she could start investigating Thompson without anyone knowing. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. This had to be handled carefully. If she acted too soon, the wrong people might notice her. If she waited too long, the truth might slip through her fingers. But one thing was certain, her life was about to become a lot more complicated. The day passed like any other, with Kate keeping a careful distance from the other officers. She didn't want anyone to know what was on her mind. The last thing she needed was to attract attention. That night, after her shift ended, she went to the local diner where she often grabbed a quick bite to eat. It was a quiet place, far away from the bustle of the city center. Kate liked it there. It was peaceful, and it gave her time to think. She sat in a booth near the window, sipping her coffee, when she noticed something strange. A man she didn't recognize walked in and took a seat at the counter. He had a worn-out jacket and an old baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Nothing about him stood out, but Kate had learned to trust her instincts. Something about this man felt wrong. She watched him for a few minutes, then returned to her coffee. As she stared out the window, she noticed the man was talking to the waitress. They exchanged a few words, but Kate couldn't hear what they were saying. There was something in the man's voice, though, something that made her uneasy. Then, the man pulled out a small notebook and began writing in it, glancing up every few seconds as if he was looking for someone. Kate's curiosity got the better of her. She pretended to read a menu, but her eyes were locked on the man. She watched as he slipped the notebook back into his jacket, stood up, and left the diner, walking out the door without a second glance. Kate didn't know why, but something about that notebook felt important. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something she wasn't meant to see. She paid her bill and left the diner, her mind racing. What was in that notebook? And why had the man been so careful to hide it? It was an ordinary day at the precinct. Officers moved about, handling paperwork and checking in with their patrols. There was the usual hum of phones ringing, the rustling of reports, and the chatter of people walking in and out of the building. It was like any other busy day in the heart of the city. But then, everything changed. A sleek black limousine pulled up outside the station. Its shiny windows reflected the midday sun, making it look more like a moving shadow than a car. People nearby glanced at it briefly before turning back to their own business. But Kate noticed it immediately. She knew what it meant. She had seen that limo before. The door opened, and out stepped a man who instantly commanded attention. Even from across the parking lot, Kate could feel the presence of Charles Thompson. His tall, broad frame and expensive suit made him stand out in any crowd. He had an air about him, something that made people stop and look. It wasn't just his wealth or his appearance, it was the way he carried himself. People respected him, feared him, and perhaps most dangerous of all, they trusted him. Kate's gaze locked onto him as he strode toward the station. She felt her heart beat a little faster. She had seen Thompson too many times before. Usually, he stayed in the background, pulling strings behind the scenes. But today, something felt different. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in the precinct, not where the law operated. It was a place where he had no business walking through the doors. "Thompson's here again," whispered her partner, Officer Daniels, standing next to her. "What does he want now?" Kate didn't respond right away. She kept her face neutral, like the professional she was. But inside, her mind was already working quickly. She had seen the limo before, had seen Thompson before, and she knew that when he showed up, things were never as simple as they seemed. There was always something more beneath the surface. A deal. A favor. A demand. Her thoughts were interrupted as Thompson stepped inside the precinct. The door opened, and there he was, walking through the lobby as if he owned the place. The officers who were there paused what they were doing, their eyes following him. There was a mix of respect, fear, and curiosity in the room. But there was one thing they all had in common: they all knew who Thompson was. He was the city's most powerful businessman, a man with ties to everyone who mattered. He wasn't just a wealthy man, he was a power broker, an unseen hand that controlled many parts of the city's government, business, and law. Kate watched him as he moved across the room, ignoring her as if she wasn't even there. It wasn't the first time he had acted that way. Thompson treated the officers, especially those like her people who didn't have the same power as Invisible. He didn't care about them, or their work. He only cared about himself and what he could get away with. But Kate wasn't like the others. She knew that underestimating her would be his first mistake. She had dealt with men like him before, people who thought they were untouchable. But Kate had learned a long time ago how to keep her cool, how to blend in when necessary, and how to make the right moves when the time came. As Thompson walked past her, his eyes didn't even flicker in her direction. He was used to being in control. He didn't need to look at the low-ranking officers. But Kate could see the arrogance in his eyes, the confidence that came from knowing he had everyone wrapped around his finger. To him, she was just another officer, someone who didn't matter. He was wrong. Kate's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She stayed calm, focusing on the task at hand. She had been tracking Thompson for months now, gathering information about his shady business dealings and political connections. It wasn't easy, and it hadn't been without risk. But Kate was patient. She had learned that the most dangerous people were often the ones who played the long game. She watched as Thompson disappeared down the hallway, heading toward the office of the precinct captain. It was no surprise. He had connections with people at the highest levels of the police department. He could walk in and demand a meeting without anyone batting an eye. That was the kind of power he had. "Something's going on," Officer Daniels said, his voice low. "Thompson doesn't just show up here for no reason." "You think he's finally slipped up?" Kate didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure yet, but her instincts told her that today was different. Thompson didn't make a habit of visiting the precinct unless it was important. Maybe he needed something from the police. Maybe he was about to do something that would shake the city. She didn't know for sure, but she had to find out. "He's up to something," Kate said quietly, her eyes narrowing as she watched the door to the captain's office. "I can feel it." Daniels gave her a questioning look but didn't say anything. He knew better than to press her when she was like this. He had worked with Kate long enough to understand that when she got that look in her eyes, she was already a step ahead. He didn't ask questions. He just waited for her to make her move. Kate could feel the tension building. The air in the precinct seemed to grow heavier, as if everyone was holding their breath. Thompson was a man of power, and everyone in the building knew it. He didn't have to say a word for people to know he had influence. The way he walked, the way he talked, it was all designed to remind people of who he was. As Kate stood there, lost in thought, she overheard snippets of conversations from the other officers. They were all talking about Thompson's visit, speculating about what he wanted. Some said it was about a recent investigation, others wondered if he needed protection from one of the city's rival gangs. But Kate knew better than to take anyone's word for it. If Thompson was here, it meant there was something deeper going on. "I'm going to take a look," Kate muttered to herself. She knew she couldn't just sit back and wait for things to unfold. She needed to gather information, and she needed to do it quietly. The last thing she wanted was for Thompson to catch on to what she was doing. She turned and started walking down the hall, keeping a low profile as she moved toward the captain's office. She needed to hear what Thompson was saying. She needed to know what he was planning. The closer she got, the more she could hear the muffled voices coming from the captain's office. She paused just outside the door, trying to make out the conversation. She couldn't hear every word, but she could tell Thompson's voice was steady, calm, as if he was used to getting what he wanted. The captain, on the other hand, sounded more hesitant, like he wasn't entirely comfortable with what Thompson was asking of him. Then, she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. "You need to understand," Thompson's voice cut through the quiet. "If you don't give me what I want, there will be consequences. The mayor can't protect you from me. You know that." Kate's stomach tightened. Consequences? The mayor. She had heard whispers about Thompson's connections, but this was the first time she had heard someone speak about them so openly. The implications were clear. If the precinct captain wasn't careful, he could lose more than just his job. He could lose everything. Kate didn't want to eavesdrop too much, but she needed to know what Thompson was asking for. She leaned in closer to the door, straining to hear every word. "I'll do what I can," the captain said reluctantly. "But you have to promise me there won't be any trouble. We're not trying to make waves here." "Trouble?" Thompson scoffed. "There's no trouble unless you make it. All I need is your support." "Is that too much to ask?" Kate's mind was racing. What kind of support was Thompson asking for? What did he want from the police? It didn't take long for her to realize that whatever Thompson was planning, it wasn't going to end well. She turned and walked away, her mind already making plans. She couldn't wait any longer. It was time to start digging into Thompson's affairs. And this time, she would make sure that nothing went unnoticed. Days passed, and as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Kate continued her quiet surveillance of Charles Thompson. Each passing hour felt heavier, as if the walls of the precinct were closing in around her. The more she uncovered, the more she realized just how deep his influence ran. Thompson wasn't just a businessman. He was a master manipulator, a puppeteer pulling the strings of the city's leaders, bending them to his will. Kate had been working for months, gathering bits and pieces of evidence. She'd learned about his illegal deals with politicians, his bribery schemes, and shady contracts that funneled money into the wrong hands. She had photos, documents, and recordings, all of it pointing to Thompson's criminal empire. She had everything she needed to bring him down. Or so she thought. Kate stared at the piles of evidence spread out before her in the dim light of her small apartment. She had spent countless nights reviewing the files, connecting the dots, but a nagging thought kept creeping into her mind: who would believe her? She was just one officer, and Thompson had the entire city in his pocket. He had his connections deep within the police force, the city government, and even the media. She was a small piece in a much bigger puzzle. But Kate refused to back down. The evidence in front of her was undeniable. She knew the truth, and no amount of power or money could change that. The problem was, without something big, something that couldn't be ignored, there was no way she could expose him. She needed leverage. She needed something Thompson couldn't cover up. It was during a routine shift at the precinct when the first real crack appeared in the wall of silence. Kate and her partner, Officer Daniels, were finishing up paperwork when they heard voices coming from the locker room. Kate glanced at Daniels, and he gave her a small nod, signaling that he was heading over there. The locker room was often a place where officers let their guard down, where they talked freely and shared gossip. Kate had spent plenty of time there, but this time, something felt different. She decided to follow Daniels, curiosity pulling her toward the conversation. As she walked into the locker room, she could hear Daniels talking to Sergeant Walker, one of the senior officers who had been with the department for years. Walker was a big man, both in stature and in influence. He wasn't someone who liked to be crossed, and everyone in the precinct knew that. When Walker spoke, people listened. "You think Thompson really runs the show here?" Daniels asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Walker, standing by the lockers, chuckled darkly. Run the show? No, Daniels, he doesn't just run it. He owns it. And if you think you can take him down, you're dreaming. There was a moment of silence before Walker continued, his voice lower now. You think anyone around here is going to risk their job to go after a man like him? You'll be fired before you even get close. Kate's heart skipped a beat as she listened to the conversation. Her blood ran cold, her fingers gripping the door frame tightly. She had known Thompson had influence, but to hear it from one of her own, one of the officers who should have been fighting for justice, shook her to the core. She had suspected that there was corruption within the force, but hearing it so openly made it real. The system was protecting Thompson, covering for him, and anyone who tried to go against him would be silenced. For the first time, Kate realized this wasn't just about exposing a criminal. It was about survival. The odds were stacked against her, and the battle wasn't just with Thompson, it was with the entire system. There were too many people who had too much to lose if she succeeded. The power of the city was built on the back of men like Thompson, and she was a single officer standing in the way of that. But Kate wasn't one to back down. Not now. Not after everything she had seen. She had spent years upholding the law, believing in justice, and she wasn't about to let that belief die because of fear. If the system wouldn't protect the truth, she would. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She would need allies, and she would have to be careful who she trusted. After hearing the conversation, Kate's mind raced. How many others in the department felt the same way as Walker? How many people had already been bought off by Thompson's power? She knew she needed to act fast before the walls completely closed in on her. But she also knew she couldn't be reckless. Every move had to be calculated. She turned back to the files spread across her table. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned them again. There was one thing, one small piece of evidence that she hadn't fully looked into yet. A series of encrypted emails between Thompson and a group of local politicians. She had suspected these emails contained something important, but she hadn't been able to crack the code. But now, with the information she had overheard, Kate was certain those emails were the key. Determined, she sat down at her desk and began to work. Hours passed as she deciphered the emails, using her knowledge of the system and her own instincts. Slowly, the messages started to make sense. It wasn't just bribery. It wasn't just shady contracts. Thompson was involved in something much larger, a plan to rig the upcoming mayoral election, to place one of his own into power. And the worst part? He was planning to use the police department as a cover, promising them more funding in exchange for their silence. Kate's breath caught in her throat as the full scale of Thompson's plan began to unfold before her. This wasn't just about illegal business deals or bribery. This was about controlling the future of the city. If Thompson succeeded, he would have complete control, and no officer, no politician would be able to stand up to him. Kate closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. She was up against the most powerful man in the city, and she was one of the few people who knew the truth. She couldn't let it end here. She couldn't let Thompson get away with it. But she also knew the dangers. If she exposed this information, she would be putting not only her career in jeopardy but also her life. She had already heard Walker's warning loud and clear. Going after Thompson was a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. Kate stood up and paced across her small apartment, trying to think through her next steps. She needed to take this to someone who could help her, someone with enough power to go up against Thompson. But who could she trust? After hearing the conversation in the locker room, she knew she couldn't trust everyone at the precinct. There were too many people who had already been bought. Her mind raced through her options. She couldn't go to her captain, he was too closely tied to Thompson. Daniels had always been loyal, but she didn't know if he was ready to risk everything for her cause. She needed someone who understood the stakes, someone who would act quickly without hesitation. Then, it hit her. There was one person. Someone who had the power to expose Thompson and make sure he was held accountable. A journalist. Someone who wasn't afraid to go after the truth, no matter the cost. But even that was risky. If Thompson got wind of her plan, it could all be over before she even had a chance to speak. Kate knew that time was running out. The mayoral election was just weeks away, and if Thompson succeeded, it would be too late. She took one last look at the evidence, then made her decision. She had to act, and she had to act fast. There was no turning back now. The day Kate had been waiting for had arrived. It was early morning, and the sun was still hidden behind the horizon, casting a soft, pale light across the city. Kate's heart beat faster as she walked toward the building where the meeting would take place. It wasn't just another day at the precinct, it was the day that would change everything. For months, she had carefully tracked Charles Thompson, gathering evidence, piecing together the puzzle of his illegal activities. The deeper she dug, the more powerful the web of corruption became. She had seen it all: the bribes, the deals, the false promises, and the way Thompson controlled everyone around him. No one had dared to challenge him, not even the police officers who were supposed to enforce the law. But Kate wasn't like everyone else. She had stayed calm, waited for the right moment. And now, that moment had come. The meeting was scheduled to take place at a high-end office building, a sleek, glass-walled tower in the heart of the city. As she approached the entrance, Kate felt the weight of the situation. This wasn't just another routine operation. It was a battle for truth, for justice, and for the soul of the city itself. Kate's mind raced as she walked through the revolving doors and toward the elevator. The sharp, clean scent of freshly polished floors filled the air. She knew what was at stake. If this went wrong, there would be no coming back. But she wasn't afraid. She had spent too long working for this moment to back down now. In the elevator, Kate looked at her reflection in the polished steel doors. She wasn't wearing her usual police uniform. Instead, she had chosen a sharp, black suit, something that would give her the presence she needed in a room full of powerful men. As she adjusted her collar, she felt a rush of confidence. This wasn't just about being an officer anymore. This was about her standing up for what was right, no matter the consequences. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Kate stepped out into the lobby. She walked toward the large conference room at the end of the hall. Her footsteps were steady, purposeful. Each step brought her closer to the confrontation that would either end Thompson's reign of corruption or destroy her career forever. When she reached the door, she took a deep breath and opened it. The room went silent the moment she stepped inside. Thompson and his allies were already seated around a large conference table. There was a sense of tension in the air, as if everyone knew something was about to change. Kate's eyes scanned the room quickly. Thompson sat at the head of the table, his usual air of arrogance radiating from him. He was flanked by a few local officials, men who held power in the city, each one more corrupt than the last. They exchanged glances, clearly surprised to see her. Kate felt the weight of their stares but refused to let it break her composure. She had prepared for this moment for too long to let fear take over now. With calm and deliberate steps, she walked to the front of the room, where a large screen hung on the wall. She didn't sit down, she stood tall, confident in her purpose. Thompson's face twisted into a sneer as he saw her. "What is this? Another one of your little tricks, Ramirez?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Kate didn't respond to his question immediately. She just stood there, looking around the room, meeting each man's eyes. The silence grew heavy, and she could see the uncertainty starting to creep into their expressions. These were men who were used to being in control, to having power over everyone else. But they weren't in control anymore. Finally, Kate spoke, her voice steady and clear. "Gentlemen," she began, It's time to face the music. Everything you've been hiding is about to come out. Thompson's expression faltered for a moment. His arrogance slipped, just a little. What do you think you're doing? He sneered, trying to regain control of the situation. Kate didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on him. I'm here to bring the truth to light, she said. And the truth is, everything you've done, every deal, every bribe, every corrupt act, you can't hide it anymore. A murmur ran through the room. Thompson's allies shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Kate could see that they were starting to panic. But it wasn't just her words that had them on edge, it was the briefcase she held tightly in her hand. It was no ordinary briefcase. It held the evidence that would take down everything Thompson had built. The moment she opened it, the game would be over. Thompson's smirk returned, but this time it was forced. You think you can just walk in here and destroy everything I've worked for? You're nothing, Ramirez. Just another officer trying to play in the big leagues. Kate remained calm. She knew Thompson was trying to intimidate her, to make her doubt herself. But she wasn't intimidated. She had spent too many sleepless nights collecting the evidence, too many hours putting the pieces together. She knew exactly what she was doing. With a controlled movement, she placed the briefcase on the table in front of her. The room fell silent again. Everyone's eyes were now on her, waiting for her next move. Kate took a deep breath and opened the briefcase. The room seemed to hold its breath. She slowly pulled out a stack of documents and laid them on the table. The first document was a set of wire transfer records, each one showing a payment made to one of the city's politicians from one of Thompson's shell companies. The second document was a list of contracts that had been rigged, signed under false pretenses, and awarded to companies that didn't deserve them. But it wasn't until she pulled out the final piece of evidence that the room went completely still. Kate laid down a sealed envelope, the edges sharp and crisp. It contained a confession, a written statement from one of Thompson's closest associates, a man who had once worked for him but had decided to come forward. The confession detailed every illegal activity Thompson had been involved in, including the manipulation of local elections, the bribery of key officials, and the use of the police department to cover up his crimes. Kate looked directly at Thompson as she slid the confession across the table. "This is the end, Thompson," she said quietly. "There's nowhere left for you to hide." Thompson's face went pale as he reached for the envelope. His fingers trembled as he opened it, scanning the contents. His eyes darted back and forth as he read the confession. When he looked up, the mask of confidence was gone. His eyes were filled with fear he had never shown before. Who gave this to you?" Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible. Kate didn't answer. She knew it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. The walls were closing in on him. The men around the table looked at each other, the shock and fear evident in their expressions. They knew that the game was over. The power that Thompson had held over the city was crumbling. There was no way to stop what was coming next. Kate stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had taken down the most powerful man in the city. And now, the city could finally begin to heal. But it wasn't over yet. There were still questions to answer, still justice to be served. And Kate was ready for whatever came next. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the sterile, white walls of the precinct. Charles Thompson, once a towering figure in the city's power structure, now stood with his back straight, his face pale and devoid of the arrogance he had worn so proudly just hours before. A uniformed officer on either side guided him toward the door, their hands firmly on his arms, not with the gentle grip of a mere escort but with the unmistakable weight of authority. Thompson said nothing. His earlier bravado had dissolved completely, leaving only silence and the hard reality of his situation. No longer was he the untouchable mogul who controlled every deal, every bribe, and every official in the city. Now, he was just another criminal being taken into custody, his past life crumbling before his eyes. Outside, the sound of the city was muffled by the noise of 100 cameras clicking, the reporters shouting their questions as Thompson was led to the police van. The media had arrived, cameras flashing, eager to catch every moment of the downfall of a man who had once seemed invincible. But even in the midst of the chaos, Kate remained focused on the task at hand. As the van pulled away, she turned back toward the precinct, the heavy door swinging shut behind her. The noise of the outside world faded away as she stepped into the quieter halls of the station. The officers in the building were still processing the events, their faces a mixture of disbelief and admiration. No one had expected it, no one had expected her, Kate Ramirez, to be the one to bring down someone like Thompson. "Did you see that?" Officer Daniels said, his voice low but full of awe. He stood by the break room door, watching her with wide eyes. Kate nodded slowly, her heart still pounding in her chest. "I didn't do it alone," she said quietly, a slight smile crossing her face. "But yeah, it's over. For him, anyway." Daniels shook his head in disbelief. That was incredible. "I've never seen anything like it." Kate glanced over at him, her expression softening for a moment. "I wasn't just after Thompson," she explained, her voice steady, almost reflecting the years of experience that had led to this very moment. "I was after the truth. The system needed to change, and we couldn't let a man like him keep controlling everything." Her words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Thompson had been a symbol of everything wrong with the city, a man who used his wealth and influence to manipulate, intimidate, and destroy those who stood in his way. But Kate had shown that even the most powerful could fall if they were exposed for the lies they had built their empire upon. It wasn't just about taking down one man, it was about sending a message. It was about showing that no one, no matter how rich, no matter how powerful, was above the law. "I've got to make sure the evidence is locked away," Kate said, her tone shifting. The adrenaline from the confrontation was beginning to wear off, and the reality of the work that still lay ahead settled in. The battle wasn't over just because Thompson had been arrested. The investigation would continue, the politicians involved would be questioned, and others might be taken down in the process. She walked past Daniels, heading toward her desk. As she passed by, she heard hushed conversations from the other officers. They were talking about her, but not in the way they had before. This wasn't the talk of a new recruit or someone who was still finding her place in the precinct. No, now, they were speaking about her with respect. "Kate's the one who brought him down," she overheard one officer saying. "I never thought she had it in her." Another officer responded, "She's the one who found the smoking gun. We were all too scared to look." Kate's footsteps slowed for just a second. She didn't look at them, but she heard their words clearly. They were right. She had found the smoking gun. And it was more than just a metaphor. It was a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she had risked, everything she had worked toward. They were acknowledging it. They were finally seeing her not as just another officer on the force, but as someone who had changed the game. She reached her desk and sat down, her eyes scanning the piles of paperwork that awaited her. For a moment, she let herself relax. She had done it. She had taken down a man who had seemed untouchable. And while the task ahead was still daunting, she knew it was possible now. The system could be changed. Justice could be served. But as she looked at the phone in front of her, a thought crossed her mind. The work wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There were still more pieces to this puzzle, more corruption, more lies, and more people who needed to be held accountable. Thompson may have been the first domino to fall, but there were many others yet to topple. Outside, the press were still gathering around the precinct, eager for their chance to ask questions, to get the sound bites they so desperately wanted. The building was a circus now, filled with the sounds of cameras and shouting reporters. But none of that fazed Kate. She had heard it all before. What mattered was what came next. She knew that in the coming days, the pressure would mount. Thompson's arrest would send shockwaves through the city, and his allies would fight back with everything they had. They would try to discredit the evidence, to twist the truth, to bury it all in a mountain of lies. But Kate had learned a valuable lesson from this experience: the truth always came out in the end. No matter how hard they tried to hide it. As she settled back into her chair, Kate felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was a feeling she hadn't expected to have so soon. But it was there, undeniable. She had done what she had set out to do. And that was something no one could take away from her. The phone rang, breaking her brief moment of reflection. She picked it up, her fingers steady as she answered. "Officer Ramirez," she said, her voice calm and clear. There was a pause on the other end of the line before a familiar voice spoke. "Kate," said Chief Daniels. "Good work today. Thompson is already being processed, but I need you to stay sharp. This isn't over yet." Kate sat up straighter, her mind already focusing on the next steps. "I'm ready, Chief," she replied. "I know you are," Chief Daniels said. "But we've got to make sure we're prepared for whatever comes next. There's a lot more to uncover. And I want you leading the charge." The words hit Kate like a jolt of electricity. Lead the charge? That wasn't something she had expected. But it was an honor, one she knew she could rise to meet. She had already proven herself today. Now, it was time to prove she was ready for what lay ahead. "I won't let you down," Kate said, her voice firm with resolve. "I know you won't," the chief replied. "I'll be in touch." She hung up the phone, her thoughts racing. This was it. The beginning of something new. And she would be ready for it. The city had changed today, and so had she. The road ahead would be long, but Kate knew one thing for certain: no matter what came next, she wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. As Kate stepped out of the precinct that evening, the weight of the day began to settle into her shoulders. The air was cool, and the sky above was streaked with shades of purple and orange as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon. She paused for a moment on the steps, taking a deep breath. The city was still, yet it felt different now. It had changed, and so had she. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she felt a sense of belonging. This city, once dominated by men like Thompson, was starting to feel more like a place where she could truly make a difference. She had spent so many years in the shadows, overlooked, underestimated, and often disregarded. But today had been different. She had stepped into the light, not with a badge or a uniform, but with the truth, and that was more powerful than anything she had ever worn. The quietest person in the room sometimes holds the greatest power. Kate thought back to the moments when she had stayed silent in meetings, when her presence had been ignored, when her voice had been drowned out by louder, more confident voices. She had learned early on that sometimes, silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was patience. The world had underestimated her, but she had never underestimated herself. She looked down the street, watching the people moving about their business, unaware of the seismic shift that had taken place just hours before. It felt surreal, almost like a dream. She had taken down one of the most powerful men in the city, but no one knew the real story behind it. No one knew the quiet steps she had taken over the months, gathering evidence, piecing together the puzzle, risking everything for the truth. But that was fine. The power wasn't in the recognition, it was in the work itself. The city was a place of many voices, but those voices didn't always carry the weight they should. Sometimes, the loudest voices drowned out the truth. And it had been the quiet ones like Kate who had been listening all along. They had been gathering information, noticing the small things, watching as the city's leaders made decisions that affected the lives of those who had no power, no voice. But now, that was changing. Now, the quietest ones were speaking, and the world was listening. As she walked down the steps of the station and into the street, Kate felt a new sense of purpose. She had always known that her job as a police officer was about more than just enforcing the law. It was about protecting people, about standing up for the vulnerable, and about fighting against the injustices that too often went unnoticed. But now, after everything that had happened, she realized something else. She realized that justice was not always a loud, dramatic thing. It wasn't always a flashy headline or a big arrest. Sometimes, justice was about quiet persistence. It was about standing up when no one else would, even when it seemed like the world was against you. It was about doing the right thing, even when it felt impossible, and knowing that, in the end, the truth would always rise to the surface. Kate's thoughts drifted to the other officers in the precinct. She had earned their respect today, but that wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. She knew there would be other battles ahead, more corrupt individuals to expose, more secrets to uncover. But she was ready for them. She had proven to herself that she could handle the pressure, that she could take on the impossible and come out victorious. As she continued walking, the city lights began to flicker on, casting a soft glow on the streets. The sounds of the evening filled the air, the hum of traffic, the chatter of people as they went about their evening routines, the distant laughter from a group of friends. The city had its own rhythm, its own pulse, and for the first time in a long time, Kate felt like she was in tune with it. She had never been one for grand speeches or bold proclamations. She had always believed in action, in doing the work even when it went unnoticed. But now, standing in the middle of the city, she realized that her story, her journey, was one that could inspire others. She had been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background, watching and listening. But she had shown that anyone, no matter how underestimated or overlooked, could make a difference if they were willing to fight for what was right. It wasn't just about taking down Thompson or exposing corruption. It was about showing people that they didn't have to accept the status quo. They didn't have to settle for the way things were. They could stand up, speak out, and demand change. And sometimes, change didn't come from the loudest voices in the room. It came from those who were willing to do the hard work, who were willing to fight for the truth even when it seemed like no one was paying attention. Kate smiled softly to herself. She knew that her story wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still battles to be fought. But as she walked down the quiet streets, she felt a sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do. She had made a difference. And that was enough. As she reached her car, she paused for a moment and looked up at the stars. They were just beginning to appear in the sky, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. It reminded her of the journey she had taken, the long, quiet path that had led her here. It wasn't easy, and it hadn't always been clear, but it had been worth it. Because in the end, the truth had come to light, and justice had been served. In that moment, Kate understood that the work she had done, the steps she had taken, were part of something much bigger than herself. They were part of a larger story, one that was still unfolding, one that would continue long after she was gone. She wasn't just a police officer. She was a part of a movement that sought to make the world a better place for everyone, not just the powerful. Kate got into her car and started the engine. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for it. She had proven to herself that she could stand up for what was right, even when the odds were against her. And now, she was ready to keep fighting. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the greatest power. And those who think they can get away with anything? They're the ones who never see it coming.